You're on.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Ricky Tatum. I'm doing my presentation slash PowerPoint on, basically the title is Through the African American Lens. And basically, I'm just using my own perspective on the myths that I've chosen, along with what I believe is basically contemporary times. And also having scholars that support that myth. So I actually have about 3 myths, and supporting scholars for that, as well as my own input as it relates to contemporary times. So the first myth is understanding African Americans' accomplishments in the U.S. So basically, in 1613, the Portuguese settled in the west coast of Africa to build their relationships with the African people, and also figuring out how they could further their wealth, so to speak. And in this case, it was gold. Gold was their economy. So they soon decided to move their empire to the New World in order to gain substantial revenue, basically just extending into the wealth America is in today. So they decided they needed workers to do the farming and build the shelters. So that's basically how this whole thing came into play as far as communism. And they began to recruit African people to travel to the New World as private property. As a result of the slave trade grew from a trace presence in Chesapeake colonies, which is basically in Virginia and Maryland, is where in the New World it all took place. Everything started to blossom as we know as slavery. And of course into a booming enterprise, mainly in the Washington, D.C. area. And my focus is, again, how African Americans survived the slave trade and their incredible achievements. So the primary thing that I wanted to focus on is why the African American Museum was built in D.C. And then, of course, this is just, based on perception. So there's, again, many negative views of the African Americans as far as non-achievers. And I'm speaking more or less of like science and being creators, not being, feeling inferior to any other race or anything. And it's also important to mention in 2003, President Bush signed the National Museum of African American History and Culture Act. I think I mentioned before how very difficult this was for him, although he was a very big supporter of it. So I think it's really worth mentioning his major support of this museum, because it actually had to become legislature for it to even exist. And the biggest forerunner for this museum was Congressman John Lewis. He was basically the forerunner of this. It took him 15 years just to get the conversation going. And even longer, shortly after is when the ball really started to roll with it. The hope of the museum is saying African American treasures. Basically in contemporary times, the main idea of the museum is to make known, particularly to the millennials, the younger folks, of the African American achievements. And again, that's got to do with the many treasures, literature, textiles, the fabric use of the clothing that they wore was not actually clothing but fabric. So all of these are symbolisms of the museum. if you ever go there, you'll see all of these symbolisms. And then of course, photos and delicate materials from around the country. A lot of things that you see when you go there were donated from years of previous generations. Some of these